And so once we have said, I am this, rather than saying I have these tendencies or I have these preferences, once I say I am this, it's very hard for me to change.
Hey, Work Positive Nation, Dr. Joey here. Welcome back to another episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Is it just me, or do you feel like you're swimming upstream in a sea of uncertainty? I mean, it's a VUCA world today, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and it grows more VUCA-ish daily. If that's even a word, right? Well, my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast wrote a book, Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. He's convinced it's his best and most important work yet, and he's written some fine books like Remarkable Leadership, The Long Distance Leader, and The Long Distance Teammate. So I've invited him to come back on the Work Positive Podcast as a guest to share with us how we can navigate all of this uncertainty and lead with confidence today. So let's lean in, listen up, and learn how to grow people and profits on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Work Positive Nation, here he is again, the man, the myth, yes, the legend, Kevin Eichenberg. Kevin, welcome back, buddy.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it really is good to be here. So, new book, new day, new levels of uncertainty. What prompted
Not necessarily in that order.
Really? What prompted you to write Flexible Leadership?
Well, I think two things. Number one is the world is changing faster than ever. The world is more complex than ever. The world is more uncertain than ever. And that, I think, requires us as leaders to think differently than perhaps we have in the past. I need to say first that I have long said and have written that more about leadership is the same than is different. A lot of times what happens when things change, everyone wants to throw everything out like, well, here's what we've got to do now.
Yeah.
And people read a new leadership book and say, well, this is the new answer. And I'm not really saying that exactly. And so the book comes in part because the context of our work is different and more complex and uncertain than ever. And I felt like I had something to say that hadn't been said about all of that. Mm-hmm. The book's also written because I've been at this for 32 years. And as I have grown in my work as a leader and working with other leaders, I continued to bump up against some things that I thought, again, needed to be said that weren't being said. And the good news is that those things are absolutely connected to this uncertainty stuff that we're talking about. So the confluence of what I felt led to write and what I thought the marketplace needed came together. And that's what led to this book.
Beautiful. Let's take on the uncertainty first, and then I want to get to those observations that you made about dealing with that uncertainty.
Sure.
We leaders isolate ourselves a lot, or at least many of the ones that I coach and work with have found themselves self-isolating oftentimes. That makes the uncertainty seem faster, but you're suggesting it really is faster today.
Well, isolation is a problem, not just for leaders, but certainly is for leaders, as you've said. And I've said for a long time that being a leader is a lonely place to be.
It really is.
And it may seem weird. Well, you got a bunch of people around you, and yet most of the people around you, virtually or in person, don't understand exactly where you're at. The people in the rest of your life don't have leadership roles, may not understand that. They kind of almost see you as the man, and you're the opposite side of that. And so we find ourselves not sharing a lot, in part because we don't know who to share it with. And that does make uncertainty even harder. Like the reality is that there's all this uncertainty, and the natural human response to that is to stop, be safe, don't do anything, be an ostrich, right? or go into denial. And there's nothing that I'm suggesting in the book or in this conversation that says, well, first of all, I think pausing could be very useful. But in terms of becoming immobilized by or hiding from is not the solution that helps, because that doesn't get rid of the uncertainty, right? And so I'm not suggesting that I have the magic bullet to reduce the uncertainty. What I think I have are some thoughts to help us navigate it, go with it, acknowledge it, use it perhaps to our advantage where others aren't. And I think that's the magic bullet. Not the goal here is not to get rid of the uncertainty, because we're not going to be able to do that.
No, there's more of it, and it really is coming at us faster. So regardless of how isolated we may be, it's pervasive in all of business today. What are some of the contributing factors to this rise in uncertainty?
There's a long list, right? There's geopolitical stuff. There's just the global nature of business and work. There's the proliferation of where people work and when people work and how people work. There's technology, AI, you may have heard of that. Like there's just a whole bunch of different stuff, but it's not just all of that, when we start to talk about, uncertainty. But the reality is that there's always a lot of uncertainty in our lives.
Yeah.
If you go to give someone some feedback, you don't really know how they're going to react. There's uncertainty even in that moment. Now, you may have worked with this person for a long time and have a pretty good guess as to how that it might land, but your guess might be overly negative, and that might be clouding how it actually comes out. Or someone who you've had really good success with in terms of giving them coaching and feedback, and they've been open and all those sorts of things, maybe not today. That's just one example of the fact that life is uncertain. As a leader, we're dealing with outcomes and others, both of which are uncertain. And so in some ways, what we're really trying to do is think about what we can do to improve our odds of success, because we don't know. Like if you go to Las Vegas and you're playing blackjack, you don't know what the next card is. So you're trying to do some things to hopefully improve your odds over time of getting better results. And so when we think about our work as leaders, it's helpful in some ways to think like Annie Duke does, to think in bets, because almost everything we're doing we can only influence and not control. So the question becomes, how can we make better bets? How can we make choices, communicate in ways that improve our odds, even if we don't know what card's going to flip over next?
Yeah, we're mitigating risk is what we're doing. And interestingly, something you said a moment ago, I call it the caveman, cavewoman part of our brain really wants things familiar. We want it safe. We want to know, hey, when I'm giving feedback to this person, they're going to say, thank you, Dr. Joey. I really appreciate that. That's exactly what I wanted to hear today. Woke up this morning saying to myself, hey, I hope Dr. Joey gives me some feedback.
That's not happened ever.
Well, it hasn't to me, not to you either. Okay. So we can mitigate the risk, that is, increase the odds of winning when we're placing our bets daily. So thanks. Give us some of those ways we can mitigate the risk and have flexible leadership as we navigate the uncertainty.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. The first thing that I would say is that we have to recognize that being flexible is the way to get there. Right. So as I said, this book doesn't suggest that you forget everything that you know about leadership and start from here. But what it is saying is that you need to think differently about what you already know. And here's why. Because chances are you've taken one or many assessments that tell you your strengths, your styles, your approaches, your natural tendencies. You have letters and colors and animals, and you have all sorts of things. Now, I have no disrespect for any of them.
Yeah,
please don't misunderstand or misconstrue what I'm saying. All of those things can be useful. However, many of us are not using them in a useful way, because what we've done is we've taken a model which is designed to simplify the complexity of human behavior, or group behavior, or whatever, to simplify it, to get our arms around it so it gives us a clue. But we don't treat it like a clue. We treat it like an absolute. And so what we do is say, oh, I'm an ENFP. I'm a red. I'm a facilitative leader. I'm a servant leader. Like whatever it is, I have these 5 strengths. Now, the problem is not those things. The problem is when it becomes identity. That's the problem. And so once we have said, I am this, rather than saying I have these tendencies or I have these preferences. Once I say I am this, it's very hard for me to change. Like changing our habits already hard, really hard when it's attached to our identity. Yeah. And so to me, that's the quandary that we face. And so the first thing we have to do if we want to navigate uncertainty and be willing to consider our approach, which is what flexible leadership is about, being intelligent about how to consider different approaches that might not be our natural tendency. This doesn't mean that we're changing how we lead every day all the time. What it means is, what do I need to do in this context, in this situation? What will serve me? What will serve the team? What will serve our organization best right now? So 3 parts to the model: intention, being willing, able to change, to flex. 2, context. What does the situation tell me that allows me to think differently or consider other options? And then last, what we call flexor thinking, which is to actually know or consider where I might need to flex in that moment. Not forever, in that moment.
In that particular moment. How does the flexing relate back to my identity? Because if I've absolutized myself as an ENTJ leader or D or something,
Yeah, right, exactly.
Then how do I morph my identity enough to flex, or the way I conceive my identity? Because that's what I really hear you talking about. It begins with information that's input, and then I begin to conceive who I am, and I get absolutized around it. Now, how do I morph that a bit in order to flex?
I believe that we want to build our identity around our values, which is different, right? If you look at a tree, or you think about a tree in your mind's eye right now, you will see that tree is consistent and stable and long-lasting, all things we would like to be as a leader. But that tree is also flexing in the breeze. Not the whole tree.
If it's still standing,
but
right?
But the leaves and the branches are flexing, right? In fact, they stop flexing, they become brittle. Tree's got a problem.
Yep.
So do we as leaders. And so what makes that tree stable, consistent, and long-lasting is its roots. What are our roots as leaders? Our values, our purpose, the goals of the organization, etc. So we should be. So I was asked literally on a podcast a couple of days ago. So Kevin, how would you define yourself as a leader? I said, I don't like to do that because I think those words become an identity, which become a problem. The only one I might say is, well, I'd like to hope that I'm a flexible leader. Now, that doesn't mean that my values aren't at core, and that and I could say that here are 5 values that inform the way that I lead, but that's different than who I am as a leader. And that's what we have to pull apart. Like if you say to yourself, if you know DISC, for example, well, I'm a C. Change that language to I have a lot of C traits, or I have a lot of C tendencies.
Or I've been described as a C.
Or I often find myself reacting in those ways, or whatever. In other words, there's a difference, and I know that you will agree with this. There's a difference between who we are and what we do.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm suggesting that being a flexible leader is focusing on what we do, which is different than who we are. There's a difference between the performer and the performance, right? And we need, and the best coaches are able to help people focus on the performance, the behavior, the result, not them, right? It's got to be first about that outward stuff. And so we need to do that for ourselves too.
So it's an application of the identity in a particular context or situation for leadership.
Exactly. And we just got to be careful that the identities that we create for ourselves don't automatically limit us and keep us from considering other options. That's the key. Like, if your leadership identity is one that allows you or helps you see the world in a variety of ways, in a both and way, then you're fine. But if your identity is locking you into a box,
Mm-hmm.
then it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for you to change as a leader or as a human.
The brain wants to get locked in that box because of that
Because it's
familiarity.
easier.
It really is.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is not easy. What I'm suggesting is to be willing to consider something beyond our auto response.
And change
That's what I'm suggesting. That's what I'm suggesting, that the world of work today requires of us if we want to be highly successful.
And what you're doing is, I think, when, let's say I'm having a conversation with somebody about coming to work for our company, right? And it's top talent and I'm seeking to attract them. And I begin to describe this kind of culture that you're talking about, where we recognize your identity and we want you to flex in the midst of uncertainty and give different responses to that. What you're really doing is redefining work at that point, Kevin, because you're not saying, hey, here's all we expect out of you, here are the tasks, just punch in, punch out, and go punch this list. Instead, you're talking about growth, you're talking about a dynamic expression of your work, depending on market conditions. And I think that must be extremely attractive, particularly to younger generations.
Well, it's extremely attractive. Number one, we have to be willing to live up to that. And then secondly, it's extremely attractive for most everyone. And not just the younger generation. Here's the way I look at that. See, the slippery slope of labels goes all the way to there. Like, people want to have the conversation about this generation and that generation and that generation, which I think is problematic, because the minute we start to label, well, they're all millennials, or they're all Xers, or they're all, I don't know what, betas or whatever they are now. Like, my point is,
they're in beta.
The minute that we do that, then we start dropping people into a bucket. And while globally some of those things might be true, they're absolutely not true on an individual basis with people. And so we got to be really careful. I would say that anyone, like a lot of what I've said to people who are, we'll just say, of my age, higher up in the age range, often identified as a boomer, who often have, in many cases, sort of looked at other generations and said, well, this is a problem, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Or why aren't they this, that, or that? And I would say, if you would have seen the possibility of wanting or asking for those things, you'd have done it too. It's just that the world has changed to say that they're asking for it, and they've been willing to ask. When you were that age, you just thought, well, I'm just supposed to put my head down and go to work. It doesn't mean that you might not have wanted to consider those options. It's you didn't think those options were something you could even consider. And so I think that we have to be really careful with any kinds of labels, because we run the risk of leading to judgment. And judgment can be positive or negative, obviously, but especially the negative judgment stuff causes real challenges for us, right? So there's no doubt that a lot of folks in younger generations would be open to the kinds of things that we just talked about. But I believe that's attractive to people at all ages and levels of experience.
Kevin Eikenberry is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty, and Lead with Confidence is his new book that we're discussing today. And there's a link in the show notes where you can click on that and go right to Amazon and get your copy. Also, Kevin's got a free gift that we're going to talk about at the end of this podcast. So keep listening, and we've got something special there for you. Let's talk about confidence for a moment then. If I'm navigating the uncertainty, then I'm able to lead with confidence. How does this Flexer leadership equip us to be able to lead with confidence, Kevin?
Well, here's the thing. When things are uncertain, we get worried, we get anxious, and then what will generally happen to our confidence? It will reduce, right? So what I'm suggesting, first of all, one of the things I talk about in the book is what we call the confidence competence loop. So in other words, think about it this way. And because you can enter this loop from either spot.
Hmm.
If I have a level of confidence in my ability to do a task, I likely do it better. Everything else being equal, I will do it better. So confidence leads to competence. If I have competence at something, if I've done it several times, feel and I have had some success, it does what? Increases my confidence. So these two things run together. So what I'm suggesting is in times of uncertainty, we need greater confidence, but the uncertainty and complexity itself tends to dampen or tamp down our confidence. So the ideas we share in the book are meant to give you a way forward to say, hey, I can do those things. And when I do those things, my confidence will grow and my competence will grow in a loop, or like I like to think of them as an upward spiral.
Talk about that upward spiral a bit.
Well, if my confidence does grow, then my competence grows, and then my confidence grows. Then it becomes not just a two-dimensional loop, a top spinning, but rather the level of confidence is here, and then the level of confidence is at a higher level. So the level of confidence is so it's like an upward spiral of both confidence and competence, both growing over time symbiotically with each other.
So as a flexible leader, what I want to do is inspire that confidence and develop the competence of those whom I lead.
But yes, and starting with me first, right? Like as a leader, we have to go first. We have to recognize that we are the model that they are following. We are the example they are looking at. And so, yes, we want to do that in others. And, who doesn't want to follow a healthily confident leader?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I'm more willing and open to following that leader than one who's not. I'm not talking about arrogance. I'm not talking about cockiness. I'm talking about confidence, right? Having the sense that we can get there, willing to do the things that help us get there. A quiet, humble assurity. Like we want to follow that person. So if we want to be a leader, we need to work to be that person.
What are some of the challenges for leaders today and trying to navigate all this uncertainty to doing that very thing, to become one who inspires confidence by growing more confident, to develop competence in oneself and thereby in others?
Well, the piece that we of the model that we haven't talked about a lot is this idea of the context. Like, what is the situation telling me right now? And so most of us, most of the time, operate, well, oh, I've done this 66 times before. I'm going to do it the 67th time. Problem is, the first 30 of those 60 sometimes, the world looked different than it does now, perhaps. And it worked great then, but it's maybe not working quite as well. But it's our natural auto response, so we do it. We treat the situation, like it's clear, like there's known cause and effect, like we have the information that we need. The best practices is a best practice. But the problem is that that's not really the way the world is anymore, a lot of the time. And so that should cause us to stop and think. So even though I said that most of us, most of the time, want to treat things as if they're the same, there's a moment that we've all had that I believe shows you that you have the ability to be a flexible leader. And that is in the moment when you're thinking about what action to take, or when someone comes to you with a query or a quandary or a question and asks for your opinion. And in that moment, either outwardly to them or in your own head, you say, it depends. In other words, in that moment, you're saying, well, it depends on the situation. It depends on the context, what we would do. In that moment, you're saying, I've got to look at context before I just automatically do what I would normally do. We've all done that. So when we say, well, it depends, then the question is, what does it depend on? And now you're looking at the situation in a way that leads you to make an intentional decision about what to do. It might mean that you still decide to do what you would have done naturally without thinking.
Sure.
You're still being flexible in this moment because you've said, okay, what is my best option, not what is my comfortable thing.
Mm.
That's at the heart of being a flexible leader. We've all done it. The book goes into much more detail about this idea of context and gives us a framework to think about that. But for the purposes of our conversation today, it's that moment of, well, it depends. What does it depend on? Let's look at the situation.
So rather than react in the way I did the 67 time,
Times
right?
before.
I
Exactly.
respond. And so I dig into the
100%.
context a little bit. But I like that hinge point of I'm not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah.
It's a different context, a different day, despite what my limbic system wants to tell me that, hey, man,
Yeah.
just go do
Oh,
what
I
you've
got
always
this.
done. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I recognize this. I can nail this. I can do it. Oh, but by the way, so as a leader, one of the things I want to do in developing my own competence so that I lead with more confidence is to do regular depth soundings, if you will, about my context. What are some ways that we can dive into the context in order
Well,
to flex our leadership?
we need to make sure, number one, that we're not making too many assumptions, right?
Mm,
Um, if you are a leader that prides themselves in really knowing the details and all of the stuff about the work of the team, um, be careful because you may not be looking at the big picture enough to
mm,
see trends, to see how the context is different. If all I'm looking at, so this is what I call the worm's eye view. That if I'm a worm, and human beings are not worms, but hang on.
I understand.
If I'm in the woods, the worm's eye view is here's that tree in front of me. That's my whole world.
Yep.
And that informs what choices I make, what options I have. However, if I'm a bird flying over that same woods, including that same tree, my viewpoint of that tree is quite different than
Yep.
the worm's view. And so, as leaders, we must maintain a bird's eye view. In fact, it's our responsibility and opportunity to maintain the bird's eye view for our team
Mm,
and to help lift the eyes of our teams too.
mm,
It doesn't mean that we don't need to understand, empathize, and see what they see. It means we can't only see that. So if we want to get better at depth finding and checking on
mm,
context, that's one thing we need to do. Another thing we need to do is make sure that we're varying our inputs,
mm.
that we're varying what we're reading, what we're looking at, who we're listening to, who we're reaching out to. Um, do we have a good sense of what's going on with our customers, internal or externally? Do we have a good sense of what's going on in the industry, in our industry?
Mm.
Are we aware of what's going on in the news without spending too much time there,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. Dr. Joey here with a question. What if the key to growing your work culture hides in plain sight? Take the free Work Positive Culture Assessment to discover it. Get insights in less than 4 minutes that transform your culture so you grow people and profits. Just answer 13 simple questions and discover your culture stage, your strengths, and get personalized next steps. Receive your free aha culture moment at workpositive.today. Go to workpositive.today right now. Wow. Kevin Eikenberry is the author of Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty, and Lead with Confidence. Kevin, I shared with Work Positive Nation a moment ago that you have a gift for us. Tell us what we'll find when we go to kevineikenberry.com/gift.
Yes, when you go to kevineikenberry.com, lots of stuff about our business, what we do, how we can serve you. Great. kevineikenberry.com/gift. And there I have for you a masterclass that I created that we sell every day for $79 about building your confidence and the confidence of others, as we've talked about today. Very specific um, online, uh, asynchronous, take it whenever you want. You have full access to this masterclass at your leisure for free when you go to kevineikenberry.com/gift.
That's great. And so we can begin doing exactly what you're talking about in the book. Also, in the show notes, you'll find the link to connect with Kevin on LinkedIn. So feel free to message him there, reach out to him.
Yeah, please do.
talk about flexible leadership and get some more points and tips. Of course, the best way to do that is to start with the book, right? And then we go from there, and there's a link to Amazon right there for you to buy it, because that's where we all buy our books. So, Kevin, tell me, what's one thing you would recommend to Work Positive Nation to start doing today to create a positive work culture as a flexible leader?
If I could give you one thing to do today, it would be to recognize that flexing is valuable, that whatever the situation you find yourself in, you should consider how to respond, how to communicate, how to decide, how to act in that moment that will serve both outcomes and your team best in that moment. When we're thinking about balancing outcomes and others as a leader, we're creating a more positive workplace and we're creating better results.
Thank you. Kevin Eikenberry, the author of Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty, and Lead with Confidence, has been my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Connect with him on LinkedIn using the link below. Go get yourself a copy of the book, but especially go to kevineikenberry.com/gift and avail yourself of this free masterclass. Kevin, that's a very generous gift. Thank you so much. I'm better for this conversation today. I'm a more flexible leader. I'm sure Work Positive Nation is too. Thank you so much for the gift of your time and wisdom.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
I'm grateful you joined our conversation about creating positive work cultures that grow people and profits. Connect with me directly on LinkedIn today. Just search for Dr. Joey Fawcett or click the link that's below in your show notes. When you send your connection request, mention that you're a podcast listener, because I want to give you a free digital copy of my Work Positive Team Edition book. That's a $19.95 value. It contains practical strategies that I've personally used with clients to transform toxic work environments into thriving cultures. We explore how to create a positive work culture in every single one of these episodes. Our LinkedIn connection, though, allows you and me to directly talk about your specific challenges. I personally read and respond to your messages because I genuinely care about your success in creating a positive work culture. So go to LinkedIn and let's connect. Remember to mention you're a podcast listener to receive your free Work Positive Team Edition book. I look forward to seeing you on our next episode of the Work Positive Podcast.